Good evening and welcome to High Five Reloaded. I'm your host, Crystal Gift. So all of you tuned in with us for the next hour, I thank you and we hope to have an interesting program. As we discuss tonight, the fortunes of Jack Warner and the ILP. The situation, this is a most unique situation, to say the least. The fact that somebody has been arrested and charged is not so unique. I mean, it happens almost all the time. But what Mr. Warner sought to do with the ILP was quite remarkable, and that journey may not yet be over. What we're going to be discussing this evening is the implications of his arrests and the fortunes of the ILP as we go towards the 2015 national elections. Now, I have as my guest this evening, on my immediate right, Anderson Charles from the press. On his immediate right is Mr. Martin George, attorney at law. And on his right, Mr. Barry Nelson, political commentator. Gentlemen, welcome and good evening.
Good evening. Good evening. Good evening.
Well, any opening remarks on this most dramatic development? To me, I don't know how you all felt, but it was almost like finally the other shoe fell. I mean, and I say that for the reason that with all the claims that had been made about Mr. Warner, especially going into that by-election, and continue to be made. For example, about 2 weeks ago, I saw something in the newspapers where an Egyptian minister of government was alleging that back when, I'm not sure which one of the football matches that he was referring to, but that he had in fact been approached to make a bribe. And he called the name. He called this gentleman's name as the person who approached him, and when he took it to his government, they declined to accept the offer, as it were, the invitation. The invitation, yeah. And now we see in the papers this week, Australia, who has said it more than once, Australia is saying, hey, we want our money back, and they keep arguing, and apparently they're proposing to notify the American judicial system about it. So, in a sense, you had everybody everybody's talking about it, so perhaps it could be true, it may be true, we have to wait and see. And when it finally happens, to me, that's like the dropping of the other shoe.
Yeah, and the timing couldn't be worse for Mr. Warner and his party, because he had just announced that he was planning to contest all 41 seats in the election. So I think it really brings a big credibility issue for the party, which basically revolves around Mr. Warner's larger-than-life persona. He has been the ILP. No matter which way you cut it, slice it, or dice it, the party has really been largely Mr. Jack Warner. We've seen him lose the chairman. First was Robin Montano, who left. Then you also saw Lindira Udet leave. Then you saw the councillor who took him to court over the defamation issue. So he has lost people repeatedly. But the point is, he has really been the mainstay. And with these allegations, it becomes difficult for the public, really, I think, when they have to make that choice come 2015 general elections.
Yeah. Good night. And because I beg to ask a question, these allegations, these charges or allegations, is not new.
Well, actually, they are more than allegations now.
Charges, no, well, right. But what I'm saying, before he came into politics, and before he's won his seat in the
by-election.
In elections, to be a parliamentary election,
right.
He went to
the by-election.
No, before the by-election. Before the,
in 2010,
the national election, right?
2007.
Okay. So, what makes the scenario much different from back then? And it is worldwide known that FIFA have different rules, and
No, but Barry, that's a simplistic approach
No,
with
but
the greatest
yeah,
of
but-
respect, because there's a vast difference between someone, walking around saying, well, John Brown may have stolen ABC, and then now if you have charges laid against John Brown, and then you have a request for an extradition of John Brown to come to face charges, it does put it in a different scenario. I don't think, if you look at Mr. Warner's reaction, his reaction to this has not been the same as his reaction previously. He is obviously treating this in a very different category. So, and I think the public would, with the greatest of respect. I can't see someone saying that, well, this is just the same as before. This has made worldwide news. You had the U.S. Attorney General giving a press conference detailing a history that they've been investigating, and she said that, look, Mr. Warner is a central figure to these investigations and to the charges. So, I mean, while I understand that allegations may have been swirling around, it's a slightly different
It's gone
context
beyond
now, because
allegations.
you are now within the legal system in
Right.
that there are consequences that you have to face up to one way or the other.
And I agree, but this is Trinidad and Tobago. And
Meaning what? Meaning
that how do we view, from history, how do we view people with allegation and charges against them from a political perspective?
Oh, I think I know what you're getting at.
Yeah.
You're talking about the cynicism
Exactly.
of seeing people charged
Yeah.
seemingly with difficult, challenging, serious offenses, and they either get off through some loophole.
Not only get off,
or
but the public
it just
the
goes
vote,
on
right,
forever
because
without
from
end.
this, from
But
what I've
listen,
seen here, there is public sympathy for Jack Warner.
No, there may be public sympathy to the way that things have been handled
Yeah.
subsequent to him being charged.
Yeah.
But the thing is, I'm not sure that there's public sympathy to say he should not be charged, because I'm not sure anyone in the public is in a position to say, look, I have evidence to show that he ought not to be charged. I mean, even Mr. Warner himself has not yet put forth that evidence. So I think that there's a difference in terms of how you look at the question of the sympathy, in addition to which there is a difference between someone who may be facing charges locally, and now this is something international, and you have an international arrest warrant being issued for his, extradition. So I think it's in a slightly different category,
Yeah,
and I don't think the cynicism would necessarily play out, because if you look at the Ish and Steve matters as a comparator, you would recall that their biggest fight was that they did not want to go to face the charges in the US.
Yeah.
Clearly, they have put them in a different category from maybe the same cynicism you're talking about with local charges, because their local charges have been dragging on for years, and yes, the cynicism would kick in there, because people may say, well, maybe nothing might come of it, but clearly they understand the difference, and I think the public understands the difference between, hey, listen, you're facing those charges here, and you're facing those charges in the US. It's usually a different kettle of
Right,
fish.
okay, but we need to put in context that these charges does not relate to funds that belongs to the state of Trinidad and Tobago. Whereas, I'm not saying no, but we need to put that in the mix. No, we need to know.
As I understand,
has he bring up the
understand the public has
Ferguson?
been doing that. That issue came up in the by-election, and in fact, I began to hear tones of it where people were saying, look, they were even suggesting that this man makes a better candidate for prime minister, because, and they turn logic on its head and say, well, look, you have all these allegations against this man, and he's still walking free, and nobody has been able to catch him, so that he, better than anybody else, would be able to stop this culture.
But not just that, remember, it got so bad during the lead up to the elections. Remember when he had on the platform the minister from Guyana who came down and said, what is wrong with him thieving if he thief from a white man? He thief from white people. You remember?
They were saying whatever allegations of theft they were didn't relate to any local institution. They were all foreigners. So as if to suggest, if it was done, it's okay if it's done against them.
And there was a tremendous backlash when that statement was made, So I don't think that the people necessarily buy into that.
He won the scene also?
No, but that's not the point.
Yeah, but
there was a backlash
backlash
from that statement.
Yes.
Yes, yeah. You
Right,
see?
yeah.
So therefore, Barry, I think that the public is not going to simply say, well, look, it's not Trinidad and Tobago funds. And then, I mean, with the greatest of respect, I am not sure that the charges charges that they have laid don't in any way relate to Trinidad and Tobago funds, because I recall in one instance they made an allegation where they said that there was something that was due to CONCACAF and it ended up commingled in his personal account. So if
for Haiti?
no, they didn't mention the Haiti fund at that point. But the point is, if those funds were in some way to benefit Trinidad and Tobago, in fact, the Australians, I think they specifically spoke about their contribution being towards some development in Trinidad. So therefore, it's not as simple as to say that it's not things to benefit Trinidad
Right. So
and
what
Tobago.
you are saying that you have confidence in the voting public of Trinidad and Tobago that we would have made that turn in how we look at the quote unquote white collar crime in terms of who we put into office.
I would think that in a direct circumstance such as this, yes, not in the wider context. I accept your point. In other words, if it is that you have political institutions that have been institutionalizing white collar crime as a unit, but without the specific charges against one individual, then that's a different thing. But now in this case, I think the public is making a distinction because it's one individual who is not just charged, but it's also internationally charged, and he's not charged alone. Remember, there are quite a lot of others, so that lends some validity and credence to the whole process. It doesn't mean that any of the charges will be proven and everybody's innocent until
Also,
proven guilty.
His sons who would have been indicted since in 2013, they have already pleaded guilty and have been assisting the American authorities.
Well, I mean, admittedly, those were to other charges, but the point is, who knows, maybe if you dig deep enough, there might be some underlying connection, and I think that's what persons are concerned about.
I'm awaiting with bated breath within the 60 days period that these people bring the case, the case. I want to see what
is the evidence upon which it
to be
rests.
Yeah. And I think that is very important to see the way forward.
Well, from what I understand, I think Mr. Jennings, the reporter who had been hounding Mr. Warner for most of his adult life, he indicated that he had been instrumental in providing some of the information and evidence to the investigators, the FBI investigators. So it appears that there were some documents that were passed along, and I would imagine that based on their raids on the FIFA office in Zurich, remember they did raid the office there
And also they raided the office, the
CONCACAF office in
the
Miami.
United States.
That's right. Yes, they raided that and they collected computers and other documents. But obviously, they must have had evidence before that, because the request was made before that. Yes, so I would think that that's more for supporting evidence that they were looking for. So yes, we have to wait and see what the evidence is that they're bringing.
All right, at this point, we'll take our first break for the evening and we'll be back shortly. Stick around. All right, so we're back. We're talking about the developments in the ILP and in particular with Mr. Jack Warner and the extradition proceedings against him. Tell me something, Anderson. What have you heard about the resources of Mr. Warner?
Well, based on the reports coming out from the international media, and also, remember, his sons would have pleaded guilty to indictments that were made since in 2013, and they have been cooperating, along with Mr. Chuck Blazer. He's a U.S. citizen who was a very close ally of Mr. Warner. And among those three individuals, I think they were able to get access to all of Mr. Warner's accounts, wherever they were, and the United States Department have frozen those accounts. So Mr. Warner has not been able to have access to his money. As a result, this counsel guy, from former ILP guy, who would have, yes, who would have brought a suit against Mr. Warner and would have been awarded $250,000. He said that he has been attempting to get the money from Mr. Warner, and that all attempts have been futile. So he's now filing bankruptcy proceedings against him to ensure that Mr. Warner would not be able to contest the general election 2015.
Well,
Martin, that raises the point about eligibility.
Yes, it does.
For
It does
the
indeed.
2015
It does
elections.
indeed. Because the thing is, one of the things that the law sets out under the Representation of the People Act is that you must not be a bankrupt. You must not be declared a bankrupt in order
Among
to
other things.
Among among other things, because of course there's the question of the offenses. I mean, I don't know how speedily that will proceed in terms of our election
I feel
timeline.
that will take a lot of time.
But the point is, yes, because there
He
would be the
he-
challenges
he
to
will want
the
appeal
extradition.
and
That's
might
right.
even go straight to the Privy Council.
Yes, but in terms of what Mr. Charles is sharing about his assets being frozen, I haven't seen that or read of that. That, I mean, it's not something I've heard of. But I mean, Mr. Charles is in the media, so I would assume that he has his nose to the ground more than
Yes,
anything
yes,
else in that regard. But Mr. Gift, in terms of your question as regards eligibility, I think that it's a question of Mr. Warner deciding whether he is going to throw down the gauntlet and say, well, look, I'm still going ahead. And I think basically, you saw what the headlines were today, yesterday. He said, I have nothing to lose. So I think he's at that point. But interestingly enough, I would have thought that he had already lost the Chaguanas West seat even before
Yes,
this
even- well, that's what the polls are
incident
saying.
arose.
That's why he has nothing to
That's
lose.
and that's why,
In a sense,
if you
because he's
notice,
lost already.
very cleverly when they asked him, well, okay, which seat are you going to run for? He says, I haven't decided yet. Now, this is a seat you won by the largest margin in history. If you are undecided about running for that seat, that tells me something that, look, the tide had already turned in terms of his personal credibility among his constituents. Now, I think that had nothing to do with the FIFA incident, and it certainly turned, I think, before the FIFA incident. So therefore, when you put that in context, if you as the leader do not have enough credibility to win in what is supposed to have been your strongest seat, then I think really as a party, you know, I mean, I think the idea is just to be a spoiler, you know, basically, and maybe to see if you can leverage that at some point with maybe some accommodation or something of the sort. But really, I don't think the ILP is approaching this election with any realistic hope of winning any single seat. Because if you look at the polls, you look at where their strongholds are, while they may have some widespread scattered support, it's not concentrated enough in any one constituency anywhere in Trinidad or Tobago. And I say this with the greatest of respect to the recently deceased Mr. Coker. You know, I don't think that they have any stronghold in any one seat sufficient to give them a majority.
Yeah, but